Welcome to Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. I am your host, Joy Vacherbeck, and this is my co-host, Mark Renahan.
How you doing, Joy?
I'm doing good. How are you, Mark?
I am excellent today.
Great. We are starting a 4-part series today on Cuba from the 1950s to the present. And we will have with us today Dr. Fred Valdes, and we'll hear his experiences from childhood in Cuba and then how much he appreciates the freedoms here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we introduce Dr. Valdes, we have again decided to do a 4-part series, and this is our series on Cuba. Now, myself, I am really fascinated with people growing up in different cultures in different countries, and especially a lot of people don't know the entire story of Cuba. Thankfully, the good doctor is here today to tell us about his time and how life was in Cuba prior to the Castros and the communism regime taking over, how his life was then until when they did take over, and things that happened from there. So, doctor, are you with us?
I'm with you.
All right, sir. Thank you for joining us. So I want to just jump right in. I know we spoke briefly on the phone, but maybe you could give us just a little brief biography of what life was like. I believe it was San Juan was the small town that you grew up in Cuba. What it was like from before the Castros took over in the communism regime and after, and your experience in getting to America.
Well, first of all, I appreciate being here. You guys are doing a great job, and it's a really great opportunity to expand on this knowledge a little bit. My experience is not unique, and I think we spoke about that on the phone. My experience is the same or similar to thousands and thousands and thousands of kids. I was born in the Santa Clara. It's the center of the island. But I lived in a small town maybe, I don't think it was more than 2,000 people. And it was no different than a small town in USA. You know, it was a town where everybody knew everybody. Nobody locked the doors. All the dreams. I used to go fishing. My dad was a landowner. We had a couple of farms. We were not wealthy, but we were fine. You know, there were mid-sized farms, cattle farms, and sugarcane plantations, and so on. And it was one of those childhoods that, in the summer you go fishing with your friends to the river, and you go swimming in the river, and you go hunting and doing all kinds of things, riding my bicycle through town and so on. And then what's amazing is that the changes that Castro brought to the island became pretty much overnight, and it's one of the things that is impacting in this whole story about Cuba. Nobody expected it, and those who saw it, we spoke about this before. I remember clearly the intelligentsia, the professionals, the doctors, the attorneys, the lawyers, the educated people. They are the ones who said, no, this will not last here. This will not happen. This will not last, period. This will never happen here. And of course, we're talking 63 years ago already. As far as, to appreciate the story, quote unquote, you have to have a perspective of what was Cuba before and what it is now. We fall sometimes, and I understand that perfectly. We fall into the trap of.
Nope.
Did we lose him?
No, he's there. Go ahead.
Okay.
Nope. Doc, you there?
Doctor?
Some years back, I checked into the United Nations stats about Cuba in 1958, and that's what I use. When I have discussions and talks about Cuba. The largest, huge percentage of doctor-patient ratio, if you want to go into medicine. Cuba was, I don't know if you know this, the originator of the HMOs. The HMOs originated in Cuba in the 1950s, where they had the bus and picked up people at home and took them to the clinics and so on. And there were private clinics that were very expensive, but there was also public clinics. And what's interesting is that the top named doctors who had private practices and worked in private hospitals actually went to the public clinics and provided services and so on. So you can go on and on. I don't want to waste a lot of time here on that, but it was at a point where for example, 6 airports in an island that's fairly small. At the time, it was only 5.5 million people or so, 6 million people. And it had 6 airports, 2 major ones, one in Havana, one in Oriente province. And they were major airports. There was one in Santa Clara, and they were international airports. And there were 2 or 3 smaller airports. So, and this is in 1958, folks. So we're talking a small country, small island in 1958. The Cuban dollar, there were times in the 50s that was higher than the Cuban peso was actually higher than the dollar a couple of times in the 50s.
Wow.
So the value of the money was incredible. The banking system was, so I'm not going to idealize and say it was paradise. Of course, there were things that were wrong. Of course, there were things that were mistakes. And of course, there were abuses by previous governments and so on. But all things considered, when you look at it, a large middle class, a thriving economy, freedom to travel, freedom to own businesses. It had TV stations were pretty much close to the United States, because the proximity to the States, number one, and number two, Cuba always had a relationship with the States. American things when I was a kid in Cuba were revered. Anything American was revered. Okay, if it's American, it's great. And also, of course, the United States had a lot of businesses in Cuba, and industry and sugarcane mills. I remember visiting as a kid a sugarcane mill, and it was an American.
Doctor, are you there?
Give it a second. Come right back.
Okay.
Doc, you there?
That's a point that one of the reasons why I wrote, my last book, to contrast that point.
Yeah, Doc, it sounds a lot like Havana, Cuba in general, prior to the Castros, was very similar to the United States. Can you hear us, Doc? Doc, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfect.
Okay, sorry.
You were
It sounds to me like one of the Havana, Cuba in general, prior to the Castros, was almost the exact same as the United States. I mean, you had freedom, like you said, you were traveling wherever you wanted to go, and then things
American
unfortunately
businesses.
changed. Correct?
Exactly. People visited Miami. There was a ferry, Havana-Miami ferry, that people on weekends just go to Miami and go to Miami on a ferry. Now, were the poor people? Of course they were, like everywhere else. But all things considered, in Latin countries at that time, it was really on top. I'm talking the stores, the movie houses. Take my small town, the small town San Juan de los Hieros. It was a small town, like I said. That town had a nice movie house. It had three pharmacies. It had 2 gas, I don't want gas stations, but gas pumps, so you could get gas. Had a private taxi service, had a central park, and had and the park had a gazebo where they had a local music band that played on weekends, and had another small park for kids with swings and stuff like that. It had stores where people shop, and on weekends people would come from the country and attend the social events in the town. The carnival had carnivals, like a Mardi Gras type thing that was great. So the memories from that town are incredible, and there were so many towns in Cuba that were like that. So that's a contrast that what was then and what it became. And pretty much overnight, when Castro took over, the division started. The people got divided, those who favor the revolution, quote unquote, and those who even question the narrative. Those who questioned the quote unquote revolution were pariah. They were enemies of the state, basically. And that started destroying the country. The country was destroyed. And it's not my words. It's not a political opinion. This has nothing to do with politics, really. It doesn't. It has to do with a system that is not only corrupt, but that was sold to the people as the salvation of Cuba. And
Doctor, were there a lot of people in your town that supported the revolution or no?
Initially, yes. Initially, there were people who supported it, and then there was another group that didn't support it, but they said, "Don't worry, this is not going to last." And even after the Cubans came to Miami, okay, the first wave, I remember nobody opened the suitcases. They lifted up suitcases for months because the phrase was, "Don't even bother opening a suitcase. We're going to be back in 2 or 3 months. That's not going to last. Communism will never last in Cuba."
These are the educated people you were talking about earlier.
I'm talking about the educated people. You know, and Cuban immigration is very unique, especially the first wave of immigrants that came to Miami, because they didn't come for economic reasons. No. They came looking for freedom. They came to escape totalitarian system. So they were the doctors, they were business people. It started with the very rich, obviously, but then it came down to the professional class. You know, business owners, doctors, dentists, and so on. They came in waves. Okay, it was a bleeding of talent. So that created a very unique situation where you had, you know, one of the stories I think I mentioned in my book. Years later, when my dad was able to leave, he never did physical work in his life. You know, he was a landowner, but he did whatever he had to do to make money. So he was washing dishes at a hotel downtown Miami. And one night he comes home and he had tears in his eyes. You know, my father was one of the old guard type guys, tough guy, stoic all the time. And my mom said, what's the matter with you? What's going on? He says, "I just found a guy who was one of the top surgeons in Havana that he knew because he had treated his father, washing dishes next to me." Okay, and my dad stopped him and said, "Well, I'm so-and-so. I know who you are. What are you doing here?" And the surgeon said, "You know, I have to do whatever it takes to feed my family." So those are the stories that, in my opinion, have never been told. Have never been told to that point. There's been some attempts here and there. There was a movie called the Old City, the Lost City in Havana, or something like that, Andy Garcia. But it was, I thought it was a very poor attempt to capture the whole thing. So that's you know, that's a scenario that I based all this story on.
So you have a flourishing middle class all of a sudden start to disappear?
Say again?
A flourishing middle class you were talking about, and a lot of the freedoms that you had disappeared.
A flourishing middle class disappeared.
You know,
the professional class disappeared.
You know, it's funny, Doc. We were talking earlier offline, and we discussed, you know, how a lot of people, they just don't know the whole situation in Cuba, and some people might see the stories of people coming across on a raft, you know, and a lot of people think like, oh well, people are trying to get to America for economic reasons or because they want a Big Mac, but that isn't the case. They just, you know,
right.
Like the surgeon who's washing dishes, he probably came to the decision, it's communism, or I can go to the USA and, you know, maybe I'll be washing dishes, but I'll be free. And he chose freedom over communism. And it's a message I think that we need to push to people today to understand, you know, again, we say it here that like Cuba prior to the Castros, it of course wasn't 100% paradise. There's always some corruption in governments, but it was doing well. It was the best, you know, thing that we have going, and then that was taken. And my next part I want to get into, Doc, not to switch subjects, but I wanted to talk about how you got to the U.S. I know in your book, it's called the fishbowl. There's a scenario when you were going to fly out, and you're separated from your parents. And I was talking to Joy, my co-host, who's obviously a mom, and we were discussing how, like, you know, you were touching your mother through the glass, and how ridiculously difficult that must have been. But you want to touch base a little bit on that story, Doc?
Of course. Let me set the background on that. Remember, I come from a small town.
Nope. We lose you again, Doc? There we go. Oh. Doc, you there? Come back in.
Talked to my dad, and he said, look, your son is involved in this and that and that. You know, I was getting together with friends and talking about, we were actually planning to revolt against Castro and all that, being so naive, thinking nobody knew about it, right? In a small town, you know, and we were really thinking about going to the mountains and fighting Castro and all that kind of stuff. And everybody knew. So this guy who was a friend of my grandfather actually came and said, look, your son's involved in that and that and that. You need to get him out of here as soon as possible because he's either going to end up in jail or worse. So that night, I'm an only child, okay? And that night, my parents decided it's time to get him out of here. And we went through months of, you know, I came through a program, I guess you're familiar with the Pedro Pan or the Peter Pan program, where more than 13,000 kids actually were sent over by the church, by the Catholic Church. I'm a Methodist, so the Methodist Church had something similar. And we came here under the guise of we're going to a church camp, so on and so on. And after we were here, we asked for political asylum, which was lawful. You know, I actually came here following the law at the time.
And how old were you at that point?
I was past 11, 12, around there. Okay.
Wow.
So finally, and you know, you couldn't say, my friends are asking me, are you leaving the country? And you couldn't say anything because you didn't know if you said it, who they were going to tell. So you lived in that kind of atmosphere for months. And finally one night, decided to go to Havana. I had an aunt that lived in Havana. And I left in the middle of the night, not being able to say goodbye to my friends at church or anything, hiding on the back seat of a car, covered with a blanket. And we left to Havana, and I stayed with my aunt until, you know, it was a scene where every day my visa, exit visa, came through the Dutch consulate. Okay, I took one of the last flights, KLM flights, out of Havana back then in 1961. And the scene was, I would go to the Dutch consulate, talk to the contact that we had there, and he would come out and say, move his head no, meaning the visas were not there yet. And on the streets, all the militia guys with the machine guns and everything, screaming, you know, you're worms, you're vermin, get out of here, so on and so on and so on. You couldn't answer, you couldn't say anything. And that went on for days and days and days and days. Finally, one day, I went there, and the contact that we had working on the embassy came out. It's a Cuban guy, and he said, "Follow me." It was like a movie, like a spy movie. He said, "Follow me."
Oh. Sorry, everyone. Oh, there you go. Internet's a little spot.
Me, you don't know who I am, you don't know my name. And he got in a car and took off. I got back to my aunt's. My aunt called my mom because the town where we lived was about 3 hours away. So my mom managed to come over, and my dad, and it was like a blur. In 2 or 3 days, we were at the airport in Havana, and the way it worked, and that's the chapter or the segment of the book called The Fishbowl, because it became infamous. The name peseta, which means fishbowl, became a term that was very infamous to kids that were living. It was an enclosed section in glass at the airport. The flight was at 4 o'clock, and you went behind the glass at 8 o'clock in the morning. All you had was water, but you couldn't eat, drink, anything. And the scene was, most of the people that were leaving, the majority, 95, 96%, were older people or kids, underage kids, younger than I am. There were kids there, 10, 9, being sent out. because basically what they did, they passed a law. It was called Patria Potestad in Spanish. Translation basically means kids belong to the state, not to the parents. The parents have no say on what the kids learn,